We're live on video.
Thank you. I'm Rakesh Mohan, President and CEO of the Center for Social and Economic Progress, which was formerly Brookings India. This is the third part of a series on in India's fiscal framework, essentially based on the report of the recent report of the Finance Commission, of the 15th Finance Commission, of which Mr. N.K. Singh was the chairman. And the first of this series did involve his participation in that as his keynote address. This has been organized by Professor Anoop Singh, who is a distinguished fellow in CSEP. So today's topic is regional inequalities and implications for federalism. What I will be doing is to introduce all the participants today to begin with, and then hand over to Professor Anoop Singh to moderate the discussion. So let me start with our speaker for the day, Dr. Pronab Sen. He is currently the program director of the International Growth Center India program. He has in the past served as chairman of the National Statistical Commission, the principal economic advisor, Power and Energy at the Planning Commission. He was indeed the first chief statistician of India and also secretary in the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. In the Planning Commission, he was the principal author and coordinator of the 9th and 10th five-year plans. And I guess, Pranab, those produced the highest growth rates we ever had, right?
Yes, we did.
So you can appropriately take credit for that. But that was aided by the
blame on others.
But that was aided by the excellent monetary policy that I did for the Reserve Bank.
Oh, absolutely.
So
great team there.
And also the various midterm appraisals of the 8th, 9th, 10th five-year plans. We are really delighted and privileged to have Pranab as our main speaker this evening. The two discussants are Professor Chinmay Tumbe. He will go first after Pranab. He's assistant professor at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He's been a visiting scholar at the Harvard Business School and assistant professor at the Tata Institute for Social Sciences in Hyderabad and a postdoctoral fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. He also served as a member of the working group on migration constituted by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, Government of India. He is the author of two books, both recent, India Moving, A History of Migration, 2018, and more recent, The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, which came out in 2020, just when the next pandemic hit. So he must have had some advanced knowledge to do this book, to bring it out in 2020, focusing on previous pandemics up to 1920. Assuming that the book took at least some time to prepare, he obviously knew much more than most people in the world that the pandemic was coming. His research on migration studies, urban economics, and business and economic history has featured in journals, newspapers, policy portals, etc. Thank you very much, Professor Tumbe, for being with us today. Sajjid Chinoy is JP Morgan's chief India economist and also a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. He's very familiar with the work of the Finance Commission since he served as a member of the Advisory Council to the 15th Finance Commission and has also previously served on several RBI committees and task forces, including the RBI's expert committee to revise and strengthen the monetary policy framework that proposed inflation targeting in 2014. And I wonder if he's advising the government now as the member of the Economic Advisory Council on the review of that monetary policy framework that is due this year. He has been ranked by the Asset magazine as one of the best individuals in fixed income research in India for every year since 2014. Sajjid has authored many publications on the Indian economy, including co-editing a book on Indian economic reforms. He has previously worked at the International Monetary Fund and also at McKinsey. He has a doctorate from Stanford University, and I first came across him when he had just finished his doctorate in one of our first India Economic Reforms conference. It's at Stanford. So thank you very much, Sajjid, for finding the time to be with us today. And maybe after the after this session, you can tell us all about what's happening in the US bond market, which will then affect us in the coming days and months. Let me finally introduce our distinguished fellow, a highly distinguished fellow, Professor Anoop Singh. He was, of course, a member of the 15th Finance Commission. He was prior to that at the International Monetary Fund, and his appointments included being director of the Asia Pacific when he retired, at the time that he retired, and prior to that, director of the Western Hemisphere Department. So he was in charge of all of Asia and Pacific, which included India. In fact, he was the director of that department. I was executive director in the IMF. And prior to that, he was, as I said, director of the Western Hemisphere Department and had to cope with many of the Latin American crises that occurred during the time that he was the director. He's taught at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. as an adjunct professor and has worked and written extensively on macroeconomic surveillance and crisis management issues. So we are really delighted to have such a distinguished panel with us this evening. Let me just mention that, as I said, first will be Pronab Sen, then Professor Tumbe, then Dr. Sajjid Chinoy. After that, we will have open questions. And so you can pose your questions through the Q&A tab on the Zoom, on the Zoom screen that you see. And they will be curated, and Anoop will then pass on some of those questions to the panelists. As I said, this is the third of these sessions, and watch the space should we decide to have more sessions on the same general issue. Anoop, all yours.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a great group, so I will not start off by speaking very much. Let me just make one or 2 points. As you can imagine, the Finance Commission has done a report for 5 years. We've done projections for 5 years of many variables. We could not avoid the most important factor was trying to project growth for India over the next 5 years. I won't go into how we did that and what that means, but that was an important contributor and input to a lot of our work and its implications. The good news is that we are talking about growth, whether that's a recovery or whether it's growth in something else. What we do know, I think, is there are 3 things we know. One is that whatever growth will take place after COVID, whether it's recovery or growth, will likely be uneven. That's number one. Number two, as we look back 10 years, no other than Thomas Piketty spoke of why productivity might develop in a way that the advanced countries will face growing wealth inequalities. And then the last 10, 20 years, the growth leaders of the world have probably been China and India. Okay. In that period, there's no doubt that India has grown incredibly fast. And there's no doubt that per capita income at state levels have gone up a lot in the past few decades. The problem before we look ahead is trying to find out, is it that the growth India has had the last 20 years and China, but has India been very uneven? Is it that even after the economic reforms of 91, what we've seen is growing dispersions of state per capita incomes? And I think this has got less attention in the advanced countries. The issue is, why is it that countries like India and China have had this incredible growth for 20 years, but from any convergence factor you look at, whether it's growth rates or incomes, there probably has been more divergence than expected. And then for India, the issue is, what are the factors? And I'm hoping Pronab will give us some of the facts. But is it true that we've looked at growing disparities? And if so, what are the factors? Is it that the Finance Commission or Finance Commissions have not done enough. But to my mind, finance commissions look at equating the provision of public services and equalization from some perspectives, but they're not there to affect per capita income disparities of states. Maybe they are. Is it that our transfers have not been progressive? So my only point is this, Pranab, is it a fact that disparities have grown as our growth rates have increased? And if so, how do you look at the factors? And that's before we turn to Chinmay later on and see whether migration has been a positive or a negative factor. So Pranab, over to you, please. And thank you so much for speaking.
Thank you very much, Anoop. But may I begin with thanking CSEP for doing me the honor of asking me to lead this discussion off, and particularly Dr. Mohan. Now, as far as the scenario that you've laid out, I think we need to get a few things clear. First of all, there's been a lot of work on regional inequality in India. There's a huge body of literature on it. And the findings of a lot of that literature are very interesting. The first, of course, as you very rightly said, that there is no evidence of any form of convergence, whether we look at the per capita income levels or, for that matter, growth rates. So absolute convergence doesn't exist. If anything, there has been absolute divergence. However, when you look at what's called conditional convergence, that is weakly positive. There has been conditional convergence, which means that once you correct for the initial conditions, then there is a very mild, weak convergence that has been happening. But there, I think, are a number of issues that we need to look at. The first, I think, is that the way the sort of state level per capita GSDP has been behaving, we seem to be moving to a bimodal distribution in terms of the distribution of per capita state GSDPs. Which means, in effect, that the middle of the original distribution is either tending in one way, which is upwards, or trending downwards. So what you are getting are localized convergences happening. But when you look at the big picture looks like no convergence or divergence, in fact. So the nature of the change is important, which is why you really need to look at what's happening to distributions rather than to the numbers that get tossed around saying that the highest per capita GSDP is 12 times the lowest per capita GSDP. These are the figures that are trotted all over the place. I think it has to be a great deal more nuanced than that. But having recognized this bimodal trend towards this bimodal distribution, I haven't really seen any work which looks into the nature of this bimodality that's happening. And I think to understand what one does about it, one needs to have a feel for the kind of movements that we've been seeing. Now, this is essentially about per capita GSDP. The problem, of course, is that when we use per capita GSDP, we have one inherent problem, which is that we are comparing GSDP at current prices. Right? We are not asking the question, but how do you compare the GSDP in real purchasing power terms? Which means that you really need to bring prices in very, very clearly. Unfortunately, this has not happened. Globally, we have the Global Comparison Project where the purchasing power parity indices are developed. But for a country like India, we haven't done one of those of our own. The only one we do have is the work that was done for the Lakdawala Committee for estimating poverty. But that was done around the poverty line. And way back, as far back as the late 80s, what it showed was that the price index for the most expensive state was some 42% higher than for the lowest cost state. Now, if that was the magnitude, then I'm almost certain that magnitude has become larger now. So that a lot of what we are seeing in terms of the widening dispersion could simply be that the price behavior in different geographies in India are behaving very, very differently. And we will never be able to get a handle on this until and unless we develop a national PPP measures of some variety. Now, there's been a lot of discussion on this, and it's all got stuck around one point, which is what is the basket that you should use? Now, we globally agreed on a basket for every country in the world, from the richest to the poorest. We haven't been able to agree on a basket which is suitable for Indian conditions. But once that is done, actually developing the purchasing power parity indices for Indian states is not that great a task. But there has to be a political will and there has to be a certain degree of agreement, both of which are not quite so easy to come by. Right? But till we do that, almost every statement that we make about regional inequality in India, or the change in that level of that inequality, or what's happening to dispersions, will all be questionable. Because we do not know whether it is happening from changes in the real purchasing power of the people of each state, or it is happening from changes in prices. Okay, that's problem number one. Problem number two is that is GSDP, which is the gross state domestic product, is that an appropriate metric for measuring cross-state inequalities? Now, if we start off with the presumption, and I think it is not a bad presumption, that income is only an instrumentality, and the objective should be standards of living, which is better reflected in consumption, then the ball game changes quite dramatically. At some point, I'm sure Chinmay is going to come in and pretty much tear apart what I'm saying. But my sense is that, and having read, by the way, read Chinmay's book, I haven't read the second one, the first one I have. The migration in India is large. It's very, very large. Now, if you think about what migration does, it's a very complex phenomenon, because what's happening is when labor goes from one state to another, It's actually reducing the productive capacity of the originating state and increasing the productive capacity of the receiving state, right? And this would then get reflected in the GSDP numbers. But consumption patterns may not actually follow that same trend. For the very simple reason, the consumption would depend critically upon where the families and households of these migrants stay. If the families of the migrants stay back in the originating state, then transfers by the migrants to their families will tend to equalize the consumption. If, on the other hand, the families also migrate, it will tend to lead to a widening of the consumption disparity as well. So the nature of migration, not just in terms of who has moved from where, or for the matter, what level of productivity is being carried, also matters whether the family is relocating or not relocating. Makes an enormous amount of difference. And the third point, I mean, again, there is work on this. In fact, in the plan, I think it was in the 10th plan we did this, is the movement of capital. Because of the way the banking system has been figured, there is an enormous amount of out movement of capital from relatively low income states to higher income states. Okay? Now, this is in complete contradiction to what happens globally. Globally, capital tends to move from high income countries to low income countries. In India, it's the other way around. And the question that you need to ask, and this, by the way, it's fairly easy to make out this by simply looking at what the credit deposit ratios are in the banks located in each state. And the data is available, it can be compared, and it does not paint a pretty picture at all. So you've got all these things happening simultaneously. And the question then arises that if you want to get a handle on how to fix this problem, you'd have to look at the causal sort of dimensions of each of these, and then ask the question that what are the common touch points which we could address? Now, I think the point that was very rightly made, that as far as the Finance Commission is concerned, the Finance Commission's mandate is inherently not equalization of incomes or GSDP or even consumption. It is about the ability of the state to provide public services. Right? So what you will get, again, if you look at the data, and Anoop, you must have looked at the data ad nauseum while you're working in the Finance Commission, what you'll find is very interesting, that the dispersion of per capita taxes between states, per capita taxes, states' own taxes, is less than the dispersion in the per capita GSDP. And the per capita availability of whatever public service you wish to talk about is even smaller. Right? So the question then is that if you're addressing only one part of the problem, which is the public services, then the amount of distribution, the redistribution that you have to do is actually pretty small. So it's not going, so nobody should expect the Finance Commission, and given the mandate of the Finance Commission, to correct for this. unless your diagnosis of the original problem of high dispersion, high inequality, is a lack of public services.
Exactly.
And I have not heard of anybody making, yes, there is a lot of talk about the role of infrastructure, but as I said, the dispersion in infrastructure availability is not that bad. Orissa has a better infrastructure index than Maharashtra. So, it becomes quite problematic. Um, so we need to go far beyond, and I don't think we should use all of this to throw brickbats at the Finance Commission. It's not their remit. But in order for us to understand and to figure out why this is happening, I think we have to look at multiple causal factors and then try and get a sense of what are the kind of interventions which may work. As I said, there's been a lot of work on regional inequality, but to actually come up with these causal factors, uh, the quality of work isn't good. A lot of it is preconceived notions and hand waving. But unless all of these problems are sorted, are thought through, we will not come to any sort of categoric answer. Okay, so we shouldn't hold our breath. This is the job for people like Chinmay to take up. But to my mind, the only thing that at the moment is keeping us afloat, in my personal opinion, is the migration that has been happening, which has partially offset the capital flight that has been happening for much longer. I'll stop here, Anoop. We can come back during the Q&A period. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Just one point before I pass it on to Chinmay. I think you're kind of saying that we should look much more carefully when we talk about disparities. If we look at disparities from a consumption or better measured PPP basis, we will not find that extent of disparities building in India in the last 20 years. I think that is partly what you're saying. Am I right?
This is correct. On the PPP, I do not know.
Right.
Because we haven't got it. But the fact of the matter is, till we do that kind of an exercise, we are really shooting in the dark.
Yes, right. Okay. The second point, and this is moving on to Chinmay soon. The second point is you talked about localized convergence. Now, when you talk about localized convergence, is this a way of pointing to inequities within states and regions? Is it partly a reflection that if there's localized convergence happening in certain states, is it a symbol or is it symbolic of higher inequities within states of India?
It could be, again, Chinmay will correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense again is that the within state migration is far higher than outside state migration. So the same set of factors which play into the interstate differences will be playing out intrastate as well.
Right.
I'm almost sure that's true. But again, I have no way of getting a handle on that.
Okay. The reason, Chinmay, I talked about intra-region is I'm under the impression that the last 10, 15 years in India, maybe I'm wrong, I hope I'm wrong, the problem has moved on to inequalities between states, to inequities within states. And if intrastate migration has become more important, how do we then equate that with the apparent reality of rising inequities within states? Now, I've raised two big questions before we didn't even heard you speak. So the floor is yours now to take as you wanted and not to worry about the points I've just raised. We'll come back to those later on. Please, thank you.
Should I speak?
Please.
Yeah. So firstly, thanks for this very kind invitation. I've actually been thinking about migration and fiscal federalism for nearly a decade now. Though I don't really have much to show in terms of written output, but I did write a piece on the Ideas for India website, I think in 2013. And that was when I had just done work on migrant remittances, trying to quantify at the state level, both domestic as well as international remittances. And I do think that migration does affect fiscal federalism in India in various ways. So firstly, just to build on to what Dr. Pranab said, there is, of course, substantial migration in India. Painfully, of course, we realized it last year after the lockdown. A lot of people had to walk back home and so on. The migration numbers, though I should point out, by almost any yardstick, internal mobility in India is much lower compared to most other large countries in the world. And that's kind of a given. It's much lower as a proportion of overall population than, especially for work, compared to, say, China, and definitely compared to America, which is probably the most hypermobile country in the world. If you look at the census numbers, we're talking about 400 million migrants, but most of that is migration for marriage, which is just across village borders. The numbers we're settling on to now in terms of work-related migration is something like 100 million, which is much more than the census numbers of 55 million. So we're saying there are some limitations in the census data. And while a fair amount of this is interstate, as again, Dr. Pranab pointed out, the bulk of work-related mobility in India is within state. And of course, some states are much more dominated on this migration. Now, how does this really matter for fiscal federalism, center-state transfers, and so on? I'll just point out a very quick map on where migration happens. So I think it will save a lot of time. You can see this map now on your screen. And it kind of shows, it's a district level map. It's not a state level map of India, but it basically shows you the percentage of households in a district. This is National Sample Survey 2007-8 data, so a bit old. But it basically shows the red shaded districts are those which send out a lot of people. And they're sending out people mainly to cities. So classically, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, and so on. But the biggest hub is, of course, Bihar and Eastern Uttar Pradesh. That is a massive labor pool cluster. Then you also have the Himalayan states of Uttarakhand and Himachal. And then you have a lot of districts in Rajasthan. But you also have districts virtually within every state. You think of Gujarat, where I'm based right now, and you have districts like Amreli, Porbandar, where you have huge out-migration. And then much of the west coast of India running into Kerala, and then the southern tip of Tamil Nadu. And much of central India is locked out. And partly this can be explained by historic migration networks and so on. Coastal Odisha is another one on the map. Now, what is the significance of this geography is that one is it definitely affects one state in almost its entirety, and that is the state of Kerala. So I'll start with Kerala and then go to maybe a few other states where it has this massive impact on fiscal resources. The Kerala migration story, of course, is unique in the sense that a huge part of that out-migration is not within India, but it's outside India. And the numbers are very stark. We're talking of over 2 million people. As a percentage of population, this is anywhere between 5 or 10% of the population, which is outside. And the money that they're sending back, by even the most conservative estimates, come out to be something like 30% of GDP, of state level GDP. So these are staggering figures. I mean, when you kind of, if you want to compute a different measure of welfare, and one of the things I've argued is that, especially for fiscal federalism, we have 45% weightage on income distance, where an income measured by gross GSDP. Dr. Pronab Sen pointed out one issue, which is on price structure of GSDP, but another one is, of course, on where are the people. And especially if you think of Kerala, where a huge part of the workforce is outside, not paying income tax, right, because they're working outside in the Gulf as NRIs, they're not paying to the central government, but sending back a huge part of their money back home. And with the idea that they're going to settle down back in Kerala. This is what Dr. Pranab is saying about where are people earning and where are people consuming. So a huge part of that money is spent in Kerala. And so what I'd done many years back was to compute some sort of a metric called GSDDI, or gross state domestic disposable income, similar to India's GDP and this overall GDI, kind of gross domestic disposable income at the macro level. Can we do a similar measure at the state level, and which states would come very high on this? And it turns out that the state most affected on this metric would be Kerala, and its GSDDI number would be more than its GSDP number by something like more than 30%. Note again, now Kerala is a very interesting place because we're seeing 2 million people outside Kerala. There are 2 million interstate migrants also within Kerala, right? And so you have about 2 million North Indians now who work in Kerala. So it's this kind of unique labor market. But the per capita transfers coming from the Gulf, especially to Kerala, are much, much more than what's going back to, say, Bihar or West Bengal from Kerala. Right? And so that is the source of kind of a massive difference. So even if you take out transfers going out of Kerala into the northern hinterlands, that's a much tinier number compared to the transfers that are coming to Kerala. Tax-free transfers, remember, so they're not going to the state government, but it's boosting local sort of goods. Before GST, this had a clear implication. Basically, money was going to the state government, but not to the central government. So there was a clear distortionary structure there. But after the GST, obviously a lot of it is now going back to the central government. But one of the biggest tickets that migrants often spend on is land markets and housing markets. And a huge part of that revenue kind of is absorbed by the state government in terms of stamp duty, registration fees, and variety of things out there. So what we're saying is that this one particular Gulf channel for Kerala boosts local fiscal resources, but does not show up anywhere in the GSDP numbers. And what we're saying is then Kerala is actually relatively shown in the standard fiscal federalism kind of a framework as to be actually a bit less richer than what it actually is. Right? And the implication being that its interstate shares, if you calculated GSDDI, would actually be much lower. So as of now, it's 1.925% based on the 15th Finance Commission report. We're saying it's going to be substantially lower actually than that if you actually took in a disposable income metric. Which are the other states which are hugely affected by migration and what I would say creating fiscal distortions? Another two states which have a massive amount of international immigration, and that's Punjab and Goa. Goa is, of course, seen again as one of those places where people are going to, but Goa is also a remittance economy which gets a lot of money from outside. And there's a Goa migration survey which has been done. There's also Punjab migration survey which is done. And my numbers for those are, for Goa, it's about 20%. That is, the GSDDI is more than GSDP by about 20%. And for Punjab, it's about 10%. So when you line up all the states of India, these are the three most affected states. And they're all rich states who are shown to be, in this framework, slightly poorer than what they are. And so if you actually took in a disposable income metric for devolution, you basically have to give smaller shares to Punjab, Goa, and Kerala. Now, this is on account of international migration because the income is not being taxed anywhere. I mean, it's not going into Indian coffers. What about internal migration? And here, the three biggest recipient states, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and if you think of Delhi as a territory, but Maharashtra, Gujarat really absorbing a huge amount. And of course, the out migrants are mainly UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, West Bengal, and Odisha. Note, in the last 5 years, a massive change has happened even in international migration, where now more people go from UP and Bihar to the Gulf than even from Kerala. So that's a change which has just happened in the last 5 years, if you look at the numbers going out, at least using labor contracts and so on. So what we know is that actually a lot of international money, which was going earlier to Kerala, is now also going to UP and Bihar. And so my numbers for them were not as large as for Kerala, but not as big as 30%, but their incomes are substantially boosted by at least anywhere in the range from 5 to 15%. So what we're looking at is basically a clear impact of migrant remittances on boosting consumption and hence local level fiscal resources in certain states of India. It's not affecting all of India. It's affecting certain parts of India. And within those states, as I showed you in the map, few districts. And so this has clear implications on both not only center-state relations, but also state to ULB, state to PRI, Panchayati Raj institutions, and so on. So to kind of broadly summarize, I would say one of the big issues or of how regional inequality shapes fiscal federalism in India is that definitely migrant remittances, because of the unique way in which it shapes consumption, does play a slightly distortionary role in allocation of resources as currently mandated by the Finance Commission, and that is why maybe we need to move to a metric, like Dr. Pranab said. One is the price structure, and the price structure is in a way also reflective of remittances. For example, Kerala is very expensive, but that's also because so much money comes in from outside Kerala, right? And that's kind of boosted prices across the board, which means any PPP kind of based thing, you'll find Kerala to have one of the highest kind of price structure, which is in a way synchronous with this idea of receiving large number of remittances. And the numbers for international remittances are very stark. We know it's $80 billion. A part of that goes to NRI withdrawals. That's mainly in metropolitan bank accounts. But even if you take $40 billion as going to households, we're talking of $40 billion going to is pretty much Kerala, Goa, Punjab, and maybe in a few districts now in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. So there's a huge, importance of international immigration on domestic, on regional differences within. And on internal migration, the per capita transfers are lower, though the volumes of immigration are much larger in absolute quantities. And so it's not going to be as big as $80 billion as the international end. It's my estimates about $40 to $50 billion. And hence they boost accordingly, UP or Bihar's disposable income that much less. I'll just point out, I'll end here with just pointing out the fact of what's happening in China. And in China, you had this thing called as the hukou system, which was a very unique way of regulating rural to urban migration. But that basically said that a few people who had access to the city would be given public services and the rest were not. Right? And this was finally kind of thrown out of the door, just about last year, 2020 is when they finally fully reformed the hukou system, and they've expanded the kind of urban franchisee to that many more people. But again, China has had much more interstate, inter-province migration than what India has had in terms of interstate migration. But these numbers are going to go up. And if you think of some of the schemes which are being announced now, stuff like One Nation, One Ration Card, there's a serious issue which is generated out there as to who's going to pay for this. Or rather, why should Maharashtra government, for example, have to pick up the tab for, say, a Bihari migrant worker? Right? And it's not very clear to me about how the fiscal rationale of something like a One Nation, One Ration, or One Nation, One public policy, which is hopefully the architecture which we're moving to, plays out. So we also need to kind of be aware that we need a fiscal architecture for allowing migrant workers to go and access public services anywhere in India, because that's one of the things the pandemic showed last year, whereas people are completely cut out of the social security net the minute they cross state borders. Having said that, overall interstate migration numbers are not that high as in China, but in at least some of the corridors, the per capita transfers can be important. What is then stopping us from moving to this framework where we look at disposable incomes rather than incomes is, of course, data. And the data I've told you is NSS 2007-8. We don't know how do we make this allocation on a yearly basis. Finance Commission uses GSDP data, for example, average of 2016 to 2018. You can't really do that because with the disposable income, because all I can give you is a cross section for 1 year. And so what we would ideally need for this is very high quality data on both internal and international remittances and some allocation rule of where it is going in India. And so that is, I think, the principal challenge. But if that data part is overturned, I think we then do have a reasonable ground for incorporating, especially migrant remittances, in the issue of fiscal federalism. With that, I'll end and be happy to take questions.
Chinmay, thank you very much. I think what you're also saying, maybe that's my reaction, is obviously India's internal migration is yet far short of where China is and the US is at the other end. What you're probably saying is, as India develops, internal migration, not external, internal migration is going to increase.
Yeah.
And therefore the implications of that for policy is very important. One more point, I keep coming back to inequities within states. Because I have the impression that you look at Maharashtra and you look at certain other states, and the story coming out of some of these states, high-income states, is of rising inequities within it, especially Maharashtra. Are you saying that, do you have any sense that whether internal migration is exacerbating the problem, or it's too early to say, or we don't have the information?
It's a good point. I mean, I think there's no doubt that intra-state variations are, definitely on the right, at least for, a few states, especially Maharashtra. Is migration leading to that, widening? One has to again balance out the fact that yes, if say migrants from Ratnagiri who've been going to Bombay for the last 100 years, but the Ratnagiri is also remittance economy. It's an economy which is almost completely wired on remittances coming from Mumbai for generations now. If you think of some of the newer areas, say Vidarbha, they're finding new parts of the Pune labor market, for example, or this whole industrial corridor between them. It's of course contributing to the booming of say Pune and Mumbai, but at the same time, a part of that boom is also reflected back home through remittances. So in that sense, remittances are also a way to equalize right consumption levels across space. And I think that's what Dr. Pranab said. The fact that the average migrant worker in India is a circular migrant worker who does not really have an interest so much to settle down rather than earn a lot of money and go back home. And I think that is a very key, and that partly happens because a lot of this is male migration. Women are not moving. In China, both men and women move to the cities. And as long as you're going to have this pattern of circular migration, in a way, the migration itself is a natural equalizing force because the people are earning and then putting the money back. So that's my sense about how this equalization is taking place through the migrants themselves.
Right. All right. Thank you very much. Okay. Sajjid, we haven't talked about the macro factors here. I think one important result of the last 2 years is we all had assumed that you were in the FRBN committee, right? And you set the debt target to be either 40 or 60%, center and state. And that was what your committee report recommended be the target for India. And now we wake up and realize that our debt is probably not 60% of GDP, but probably over 90% of GDP. At the same time, we know we're coming out of COVID, and we hope there will be growth, and it will be more inclusive than maybe it has been. The issue is, what are you going to do with the streets of India? How are you going to balance the need to consolidate debt, either now or 5 years from now, with the need to spend more, if not on capital expenditure, at least on health and education? So what is how is India going to balance this out? Or can it be balanced? And you are advising us in the Finance Commission too. How would you recommend this be done state by state, year by year? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anoop. Those are great questions. But let me start by just saying what a delight it is to be here at CSEP. And Dr. Rakesh Mohan, thank you so much for inviting me here. Dr. Anoop Singh, thank you for having me here. I'm going to just use a few slides. And as Anoop said, come at this from a kind of very macro fiscal perspective in light of the very important questions you raised, and talk about, I think, the unappreciated heterogeneity of fiscal positions at the state level, and whether we can get to the next level of sophistication for sub-national fiscal rules that can hopefully attenuate any divergence and possibly contribute to some conditional convergence. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. This is a very heuristic start, so bear with me. But thank you very much. So if we can just go to the first slide and just, yeah, thank you. The first slide there. So I think this is just to put in a chart what Anoop and what Dr. Pronab Sen have said before, that any which way you cut it, there is no evidence of unconditional convergence. In fact, there's unconditional divergence. So just to explain this, on the x-axis, we're looking at 2000 level per capita GDP. Each of these dots represents a different state. This is in 2011 prices. So notwithstanding the caveat that Dr. Sen made, and the y-axis has growth rates. And what you would typically expect in an unconditional convergence model is this line is negatively sloped, that the higher starting point would lead to lower growth rates. Exactly the opposite has happened. And we don't fully appreciate the change in income levels by looking at growth rates, because over a decade, a difference, a state growing at 7%, for example, will see its income double in a decade. A state growing at 3.5% and a 3 percentage point gap will take 2 decades for their income levels to rise. So in a way, the growth divergences mask how much the levels are diverging. But this is just to set the record. If you can go to the next page, please. And here again, as Dr. Sen mentioned, the evidence of conditional convergence after controlling for institutional capacity, different starting points, social infrastructure is at best mixed. I would say it's very weak. You get the right sign, but you don't get the, either the economic or the statistical significance. But one thing that you do get in study after study, both at the national level and at the state level, and this is kind of, not a surprise, is state capital expenditure plays a huge role in impacting state GSTP growth rates, right? Huge economic significance, huge statistical significance, right? So one thing we do know is even if we can't get convergence, what we know for sure is by boosting capital expenditure, you're going to push up all these boats. And I guess the next question then is, how big is the dispersion in capital expenditure? And if you can go to the next slide, please. What you will see is there is a huge dispersion. Now, I've taken away some of the northeastern states which have high capital expenditure of a low base. I've taken away Jammu and Kashmir, given the special circumstances, and just restricted myself to the 22, 23 other states. And what you find is a huge dispersion. A weighted average of 2.8 to 3% doesn't do justice to the fact that you've got many states at 4 and 5 and 6%, and many states at 1.5, 2%. And this is across income. So richer states like Maharashtra or a Gujarat have got much lower capital expenditure. You've got some other poorer states like an Assam, for example, or a West Bengal that has much lower capex. So I guess the one question we can ask ourselves is, from a policy perspective, can one intermediate objective towards final income convergence be, at least can we facilitate through subnational rules a greater convergence of capital expenditure across states? Can we incentivize states that have not invested in capex to push those numbers up towards the average and even higher? And there are many reasons why this will be a challenge, which I'm going to admit: institutional capacity, incentive compatibility. But let me take what in Anoop's question was the prima facie constraint post-COVID, which is fiscal positions are going to be really crunched. And how can we in this environment even be encouraging anybody to spend more? So if you can go to the next slide, please. And I think the worry here in terms of state debt, there's so much talk about consolidated debt that I think we lose the nuance between what's happening to central debt and state debt, which is that the center's debt is certainly higher. But given the primary deficit of the center or the path laid out over the next few years, and given the difference between R minus G, central debt to GDP will actually come down. The concern has been the trajectory of state debt. So as Anoop rightly mentioned, back in 2016-17, the FRBM Review Committee had suggested that state debt kind of stabilize around 20%. We've seen that go to about 27% even pre-pandemic. And now the estimates, early estimates for the first year post-pandemic will be 31%, right? So we're way above those targets, and more than the level, it's the trajectory that's worrying. Remember, a sufficient condition for intertemporal fiscal unsustainability is a monotonic rise in debt to GDP. So more than any level of which we have to be agnostic, I think there's no magic level here, is just to prevent a constant rise in state debt to GDP. Now, I'm going to just do a little mumbo jumbo here for 30 seconds to lay out what's driving debt dynamics here, because hopefully this will inform the future discussion. And so ultimately, you know, at the aggregate level, debt is just a function of previous debt, the interest I pay on it, the first equation, and my primary deficit. When I express this as share of GDP, which is the second equation, so the small dt plus 1 minus dt, essentially there are two terms that matter. What was my debt last period? And the next term is this R minus G component, which has been made particularly, I think, famous around the world because of the recent work of Olivier Blanchard, and the primary deficit. So the way to think about debt dynamics is there are two terms that really matter. R minus G, which is the difference between a state's real GDP growth rate and the borrowing cost on its debt. And the second term is largely the primary deficit. And because I will show you a chart later that despite a lot of fiscal heterogeneity in state fiscal positions, their borrowing costs are virtually identical. This comes down to two variables mattering. That higher growth rates will all else equal make debt more sustainable and allow states to run primary deficits. And on the other hand, higher primary deficits, ceteris paribus, will worsen debt dynamics. So we have to come down to this horse race between what are the underlying growth rates of states and what are their primary deficits. So if we go to the next chart, I want to just lay out the importance of growth, first at the aggregate level, and then talk at the subnational level and the heterogeneity across states. I think so Anoop's question, you know, shouldn't we be consolidating aggressively with debt at 90%? And how can we think of more expenditure? What's really interesting is, given our starting points, the impact of medium-term growth on future debt dynamics cannot be overstated. So the blue line here is a baseline case to say, let's look at state fiscal positions in line with what the recent budget has laid out, that they go back to about 3% of GDP by FY24. And let's for a moment assume that nominal GDP growth over the next 6 or 7 years is about 9%. That assumes a real GDP growth of about 5.5%, because the average deflator over the last decade has been about 3.2. One can argue in a slightly more reflationary environment, you get a slightly higher deflator. So nominal 9% growth is consistent with average real growth for the 3 years pre-pandemic. And what you find is, despite the states being asked to go back to their fiscal positions relatively quickly in the next 2 years, debt to GDP keeps rising and rising and rising, right? And this is the point that needs to be made again and again, that Olivier Blanchard's hypothesis about as long as G is greater than R, you know, debt is sustainable, only holds when your primary deficit is very, very small, or you're running, or there's no primary deficit, right? It doesn't apply to many emerging markets. If you're going to have a 1% primary deficit, which is what states will have, even though nominal GDP growth of 9 is higher than state borrowing costs of 7.5, that R minus G gap is not large enough to offset the primary deficit. And so state debt to GDP keeps rising. Now look at what a small change in growth does, which is that if real GDP growth were to be 7%, as an example, over the next 5-6 years, so nominal becomes 10.5, just as an example, then without doing more fiscal consolidation beyond what's envisioned in the next 2 years, debt to GDP will flatline and begin to slowly come down. So therefore, that raises the debate that's currently on, that there perhaps isn't a way to shrink ourselves out of our debt problem. We'll have to grow ourselves out of our debt problem. And the question then is it worth doing higher capital expenditure, which is known to have higher multipliers, to generate higher GDP growth, even if it means slightly higher primary deficits? Will that make debt more sustainable? That is the big question. Now, if you go to the next slide, I think we should go one level deeper here and look at different fiscal positions. Sorry for this crowded chart. Each of these ovals represents a different state. And so to understand kind of fiscal space, the x-axis has GSDP growth rates and the y-axis has state debt in 2019-20. And I've just broken this up into 4 quadrants to make it a little bit more tractable. So the simple thinking is, the higher your growth rates, all else equal, you will have more fiscal space. And on the y-axis, the higher your debt levels, right, going into COVID. So all of these will change in a post-COVID world. the lower is your fiscal space, right? So if you look at the quadrant 1, that is a set of states that has relatively lower growth rates. This is a growth rates over the last 6-7 years, an average growth rate, and they have relatively high debt levels. So these are states where if you do a debt sustainability exercise for the next 4 or 5 years, you begin to worry about that, primary deficits will have to come down given what their growth rates have been historically for this debt to become sustainable. On the other hand, in quadrant 3, you have another set of states where you've got relatively high growth rates and you've got relatively low debt levels. And prima facie, these are states that actually have some fiscal space. So even though the aggregate state situation looks a bit somber, if you go down, you get this bimodal distribution. So Dr. Sen spoke about a bimodal distribution in terms of per capita income. I'm telling you that there is a bimodal distribution both in terms of high debt, lower growth states and higher growth, lower debt states. And I would argue that this bimodal distribution is an endogenous outcome of our current fiscal rules. Because if you go back to our debt dynamics equation, if interest rates that all states are paying is the same, irrespective of the underlying fiscal position, so your R is the same, and if the primary deficits that are broadly mandated, that everybody must go to a 3% fiscal deficit, then if R is going to be the same and your PD is going to be similar or capped at the same levels, then the only thing that's driving it is going to be G. So high growth states will, all else equal, result in lower debt, and lower growth states over time will result in higher debt. So in a way, this is an endogenous bimodality that's arising from our current fiscal rules. So if we now go to the next slide, what you will see is, now the question is, this is more from an efficiency perspective. Now let's collapse fiscal space into one dimension and let's compare it both to capital expenditure and to income levels to talk about convergence. So my metric for fiscal space is a very simple one, almost too simple-minded. It's debt, the stock of debt in 2019 divided by your average growth rate over the last 5-6 years. The higher your debt, the lower the fiscal space you have, the lower your growth rates, the less fiscal space you have. So a rising number on the y-axis suggests fiscal space has been exhausted. The lower your metric, the more fiscal space is available. On the x-axis, we actually have capital expenditure to GDP. So this is just a representation of the dispersion that I showed you in the first chart. So what you find, what's very interesting is there are, so the red line, the horizontal red line separates states that have, the dots above the red line are states that don't have very much fiscal space. And the dots below the red line are states that in relative terms have fiscal space. So if you now look at the bottom left-hand side quadrant, you have a bunch of states where prima facie there is fiscal space, and yet capital expenditure is very low, right? So, and this is cuts across income levels: Assam, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Haryana, Karnataka, Orissa, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Uttarakhand. All of these states, from a debt sustainability perspective, have space. They are higher growth states, they've got lower starting debt, and yet their capital expenditure is much, much below average levels. Now, I'm not arguing that fiscal space is the binding constraint or the only constraint, but the first kind of things that comes to your mind is, are fiscal rules inhibiting states that intertemporally have more fiscal space from spending more on capital expenditure? To the extent that these are poorer states, that will, all else equal, drive convergence. You have another group of states in the top left-hand quadrant where fiscal space is very limited. When your metric is 7, right? That suggests that you've really overstretched. And yet they've also still got low capital expenditure. So that's a quick way of figuring out that these are states where a lot of fiscal space has been utilized, but it's not been utilized for higher capital expenditure. It's really been utilized for higher revenue expenditure, or one in where tax collection has been much below norm. So it's clear what the policy implication for those states are, which is that you need to consolidate, and you need to consolidate by cutting revenue expenditure or improving your revenue deficit, not necessarily slashing capex, because capex is low to start with. So this is more from an efficiency and rebalancing perspective. The next chart is the last one, is really comes to the core of today, which is, can we use fiscal rules for more convergence? Now we've got the same metric of fiscal space on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, I'm looking at real per capita income. So these are in real terms, in 2019, so they're deflated. And so again, above the red line are states with limited fiscal space. Below the red line are states that have fiscal space. On the left-hand side are relatively low-income states. On the right-hand side are the relatively high-income states. And so I think the interesting quadrant here is the bottom left one, that you've got 4 or 5 states, Assam, Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, very low income, fiscal space exists and hasn't been utilized. There are another bunch of states where you've got a high per capita income, right? You've got fiscal space. So the question is, why is a state like Maharashtra, especially given all of the discussion on internal migration that we've spoken about within Maharashtra, why does it have such low capital expenditure levels? Is it institutional capacity? Is it something else? So you've got states like that in the bottom right-hand side quadrant, where even though the income per capita income levels are high, there's a lot of unutilized fiscal space. Let me go to the next chart. So in a way, this is just this was just meant to be a hand-waving heuristic exercise to say that while it's important to talk about state debt dynamics, and we do that multiple times a week, the fact is there's a lot of heterogeneity across state debt, across state growth rates, and across state capex. And what this suggests prima facie is to have a more differentiated set of fiscal rules. Fiscal space that's not derived in a static sense from the supply side, what's my total pool of savings and how much should be spent for central and states, but really derived from some dynamic concept of debt sustainability. Because you've got states with debt at 18% of GDP and states with debt at 40% of GDP, and the implications for them for the same primary deficit are very different. Now, at some level, these new set of fiscal rules can be used to promote both efficiency and convergence, and therefore can be another metric for equalization, quite apart from the horizontal sharing that Anoop spoke about. So the horizontal sharing is the sharing of revenues. The question is, can we design fiscal rules which de facto get you more equalization across states? So states with more fiscal space should clearly be incentivized to spend more on capex, no matter what your income level is. To the extent that poorer states have this fiscal space, this will help also with convergence, all else equal. And at the same time, if you measure fiscal space from this debt system perspective, you'll have some states with great risk of unsustainability, which will need to consolidate faster than the average laid out in the coming years. So my point is, if we design fiscal rules that can help with the convergence of capital expenditure, at least that's a measurable intermediate step towards income convergence. My last 2 slides, I just turn to the next one. I don't want to be overly simple-minded about this. The first thing is, and Anoop will know better than anybody else here, that if you have multiple fiscal rules for states, this is going to become very intractable very quickly. And so the challenge is, how do you get some differentiation without things becoming intractable? I think that is the policy challenge. Political economy-wise, I can understand just how challenging this is going to be. Why do different states have different rules? Why do we think about different states differently? And so I fully acknowledge these caveats. Institutional capacity is a huge one. Maybe some states have lower capex because that's what they can provide, and fiscal policy is not the only constraint. So fiscal deficits are not the only constraint. Capex is not the only driver of growth. I fully appreciate and acknowledge all of these important challenges. And in many cases, you had states with very limited fiscal space, but had low capex, suggesting revenue mobilization needs to be an important driver. So there are many dimensions to the problem. I've taken a very small sliver to lay out something. And therefore, I think the implication from all of this is having some kind of intergovernmental body, a central fiscal council, a state fiscal council, bodies that work together, that do this technical work And in real time, in every 2 or 3 years, debt sustainability is going to evolve. And I think our rules need to be dynamic. The last thing I want to say is ultimately we want to move away to a system. State expenditures are more than the center. State borrowing is quickly approaching central levels. That we get efficient signals from the market. So there is some incentive compatibility and states can self-correct. And I just want to go to the next chart, the last chart. This has been a chart I've been using for many years and it hasn't changed. Quite interesting. That each diamond represents the borrowing cost of a state. The y-axis is how much you borrow at a typical auction. The x-axis is what your fiscal deficit is. And I could replace the x-axis with debt and nothing will change. And there is zero differentiation by markets. A state whose fiscal deficit is 6% of GDP and a state whose deficit is 1.5% of GDP pay the same borrowing cost. Why will there be any incentive for a state to reduce its fiscal deficit, right? What benefit am I getting in terms of lower borrowing costs? And because in a way we're fixing R and we're fixing the primary deficit, you endogenously get this bimodal distribution. So if we just go back to the previous slide, let me end by saying that ultimately we want to go into a situation where debt sustainability and fiscal position is reflected by borrowing costs. And so all the more reason having some institution, either existing or new, that appreciates the heterogeneity, is able to design fiscal rules to facilitate more convergence and move to a system where market signals become more important, I think become really important, become crucial. But I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
All right, Sajjid, thank you very much. You've raised so many important issues. If you put them all together and what others have raised, I don't think we have enough time. I think what I might do right now is I may make a few comments, but more than my own comments, I'm going to try to relay back to you some questions that have come in. And I will then pass it over to each of you to address them. And because we only have 15 minutes more, as I pass it back to you, we could perhaps again begin with Pronab and go on to Chinmay and then back to Sajjid. You could also make that your own final remarks. A couple of, well, from my side, Sajjid, you're raising a very important point about future fiscal rules. You're implying there will be future fiscal rules. How should they be set? Very important point. There is a question that's come in on education. Two questions. I think that question on education applies as much to you as to Chinmay. And for Pronab, we have a comment too. The point is, if education is a factor, why migration happens? We need to rebuild education or build education in states that are exporting labor. So the question is education a factor, number one? And number two, if it is, what we do about it. Coming back, Sajjid, to you, if education, for example, is a factor, and the states that are exporting labor in migration, they have low education. Is the answer, therefore, to look at capital expenditure? Or is it more to find a new way to look at the efficiency of public spending? Because as you spend on education and health and those inequalities, it may not be capital expenditure. It may need to be the focus. That's one issue which you can both answer. The second is about women. And Chinmay, this goes to you too. And that is, in India, presumably, interstate migration, as opposed to external migration, I think external too, interstate migration, the migration of women, gender, is probably much less than it might have been. So the question is that so? And if that is so, what are the implications of that from a broader productivity and work balance point of view? And as we look ahead the next 5 years after COVID, where everything is changing, if women are not moving, and that gets worse now, what are the implications of that? And Pranab, I think there's a lot of interest in at least two questions I've received, where they agree with you that there must be a broader way to look at interstate disparities, and it should not be on simply GSDP. And question one person asked, is there a way to construct another index, which I think the person said was referred to in a recent economic survey article on bare necessities, and see whether that may give us a better idea of disparities from a perspective that is probably more appropriate to see if our growth has produced widening disparities. So why don't we start with Pranab, you, and then go on to Chinmay and Sajjid and Rakesh. We have only 15 minutes left. So please, in your own remarks, Pranab, you may have questions on Sajjid's points and Chinmay. So please use the next few minutes for you also to respond to each other. As to myself. Thank you.
Anoop, do you want me to start, or should Rakesh actually do it first?
No, I think I go first, actually. I want all of you to talk.
Okay. All right. Let me first, on the focused question of alternate metrics for measurement of inequality. Bare necessities would actually be a bad metric, because all it does is it simply replicates what we do in terms of our poverty estimates. And as we know, if you look at the dispersion of poverty estimates across states, it's not that great, it's not very, very high. And bare necessities essentially replicates that. But if you're arguing that we can use bare necessities as a basket of goods and services on which to calculate purchasing power parities, then that may not be a bad way of doing it. It's not perfect. I would not be entirely happy with it, but it's not a bad way of doing it. But if you use bare necessities, you will get very little dispersion, and we will be living in a fool's paradise thinking that we are actually a fairly equal society. Okay, let me make a very short point on something that Sajjid said, which I think is extremely important, which is he pointed out to the role of growth. And when he was talking about growth, he was talking about nominal growth. Because that's what the G minus R is. It's nominal GSDP growth. So it can either be a higher growth rate of real incomes, or it can be inflation. Now, here's the million-dollar question. At a national level, many countries have, including ours, by the way, we have actually grown our way out of debt unsustainability through high inflation. So if you recall the period when our debt to GDP ratio came down very, very dramatically, which is the 2000s period, it was very high inflation period also. Now, here's the million-dollar question, which we need to ask ourselves, is whereas the central government does have instruments to, in a sense, I won't say encourage, no central government wants to encourage inflation, but to actually determine the course of inflation, do the state governments have it? And have it in the sense that they can inflate the state prices. Do they have that ability? If not, then we really need to talk about how the inflation rate in each state is being determined by essentially what are national level interventions. And are those effects asymmetric? My sense is that it is asymmetric, and therefore one really needs to think about it, because all the efforts that a state may do in terms of trying to get its growth rate up may be offset by central policy which pulls down the inflation in that state relative to that of other states.
Okay, thank you, Pranab. You raised inflation. I won't comment on that, but that is another factor in this. Chinmay, over to you.
Yeah, I think 2 points, one on education, one on gender. On education, one is, of course, yes, more Indians are moving for education as these enrollments are going up, especially in tertiary education. Obviously, people are moving. But the thing is, if you're looking at from a fiscal framework, will more investment in education in, say, Bihar or many of these other states, will it reduce out migration or even earlier, concerns of brain drain and so on? That's highly unlikely. If anything, we're going to have more migration for education as primary education levels are surging through. And again, the classic example is Kerala. I mean, Kerala has been the most educated state of India, and for a long time in terms of a lot of measures, and it still had extremely high rates of out migration. And the evidence on migration education very clear. The more basic education levels are rising, actually migration for both work and education, out migration, are increasing in those places. So I don't think there's a case to be made that with more investment in education, from a fiscal kind of devolution rule, will you be able to curb out migration or for either work or education? I think in general, India is going to see more surging migration levels for both education as well as work. And I think one person pointed out Delhi is a classic example which absorbs migrants on both counts. This thing on women migrating, it's true that in some like Chhattisgarh, for example, is sending out a lot of single female migration, generating such migrations which are not really seen earlier, but the numbers are very small. And so my sense is that if you look at just pure migration for work, it's a kind of an 80-20 rule, 80% men, 20% women. So yes, domestic work, as somebody pointed out, hugely dominated by women, but that's only a tiny percentage of the overall number of jobs done by migrant workers in India. What are the implications, again, for productivity and so on? I mean, nobody really knows how this is going to play out in the next 10, 20 years. Everyone thought those numbers on female labor force participation would go up. I think huge debate on that. And if anything, it's either stagnant or even declining. So I think that is a larger question, less to do with migration. Though I think it is related to migration in the sense I don't think we are generating enough jobs in our cities, which are like China. China, all those garment factories employed female labor. That kind of equivalent story is not really emerging in India. And I think maybe that's linked in a way with India's stagnant female labor participation. But I think a lot of studies have shown the dramatic impact of that on GDP and a variety of things. China's at 60%, we're at 25% on that one metric alone. So clearly that's something which hopefully goes up. That number starts going up. But as of now, I don't think there's any evidence that's happening. What are the fiscal implications of that? Stuff to really point exactly. I'll be curious to know if any of you have thought about this. But prima facie, I don't see so much of an impact.
All right. Sajjid, back to you.
I'll just take a minute or two. I'd love to hear what Dr. Mohan and you have to say. Well, on this whole R minus G thing, so I think the first thing is, Anoop, I was remiss. Capital expenditure in those charts of mine were merely a proxy for any kind of expenditure that boosts total factor productivity and boosts medium-term potential growth. Because I was just trying to show that trend growth matters so much for that dynamics, that any kind of expenditure that boosts trend growth, right? Social expenditure, physical, it will more than pay for itself in terms of fiscal sustainability by pushing down debt. So it was just meant to be a small proxy. Your point is well taken. On the R minus G debate, I come out slightly differently. I realize that the high inflation, 2009, 10, 11, 12 brought the debt stock down, but it created a lot of flow problems for India, right? That's where we were overheating. It created a current accounts deficit of 6%. It got us into trouble with the taper tantrum. So that's a trade-off we have to think hard about. And secondly, I would say in a world with more capital account convertibility, that if you were to get high, because remember, both R and G are nominal variables. So if G is going up because of high inflation, R will go up as well. The gap may not be in your favor. Even if policy rates don't go up, as we're seeing in the US, this is Dr. Mohan's first question to me, why are bond yields going up? Because, you know, bond traders look into the future and say, this may well be a country with higher inflation. And whether the Fed's going to be very patient or not, if high inflation is coming, the 10-year bond yield will reflect that. And the same dynamics may happen in India, where your yield curve may actually move up or steepen in anticipation of higher inflation. So I'm not sure in this world the benefits of inflating your way out of the problem exist to any meaningful degree, which therefore goes back to the first point. We need expenditures or investments that enhance TFP and medium-term growth potential. But I'll stop there.
Okay, I'm going to give it back to you, Rakesh. But before I do it, let me just make my final point, and that is pass it to you. I think you should have a similar event like this 1 year from now, or 2 years from now, or both. The reason is this. I hope I'm wrong. I do continue to believe that we are in a historic time in India and globally. And we don't quite know the nature of the recovery and the implications will have for the longer run implications will have for education, for health, women, and also the components of the recovery between services, factory, and so on. If it turns out that the unevenness of our recovery and of other countries is not more than we think it might be, there are longer run implications for inequalities. And so we need to see how states are spending in the next 2 years on factors that might prevent it. Anyway, that's my own final point, and it's over back to you.
Thank you very much, Anoop. Thank you very much, Pronab and Chinmay and Sajjid. It was really very, very substantive interventions with lots of food for thought. Just for everyone's information, we do put out the recording of this session in a couple of days after the session is done, so that even those of course who are not here, will be able to see it. A couple of substantive comments. Sajjid, on this inflation growth issue, I think one doesn't have to go off into the 2010 to 12 framework, which is a disaster. I think that we can, however, be in the 1996 to 2008 framework, which I call the 5-8 framework. That is 5% inflation, 8% growth, 8% nominal interest rates, stable, there is 8% savings, deposits, small savings, etc. It's actually quite financially stable. And if you sort of have even say, so in some sense, given that the monetary policy framework is being thought about today, these days, that in some sense, I would say that, look, why not change the target to 5%, not 4%? So it's not, you're not sort of going off to 10%, etc. And suppose you have 5% inflation and say 7% growth, something of that order, aspiring to 8, but 7 is probably more realistic. That is something that one can realistically think about. Because we have done it before on a stable fashion. The inflation doesn't take off as long as you're doing proper macroeconomic management. Second, a lot of the discussion on migration, basically, excuse me, I would have thought that migration is basically endogenous. It responds to everything else going on, whether it's international, whether it's domestic, interstate, etc. And I think Chinmay was very right in pointing out that contrary to a lot of impression, migration in India is relatively small compared to other countries. One thing it didn't mention is one of the most amazing data points is that across, if I'm not mistaken, I think we wouldn't know that what we'll find when 2021 census, if it is held, is that I think from 1980 at least to 2011, the share of rural-urban migration in urban population growth was around 20%. That's unusually low for countries at our stage of development and growth. And a lot of that, to my mind, is to do with macro policies not encouraging, macro trade industrial policies, not encouraging employment-intensive manufacturing, as was done in China. And then that goes back to the fisc in the sense that if you had much higher proportion of growth being accounted for manufacturing, which it did between 2002 and 2010 or thereabouts, and trade actually. It also has a lot of fiscal effects and of course, positive social effects. I would hark back to what Anoop said about health and education. We haven't talked about enough in this series that India has consistently been underspending on health and education, particularly public health and public education. And I think there's a whole subject, central level, state level, local level. I'll end by just saying on this one issue of manufacturing, that is rural-urban migration, that one fiscal impact of rural-urban migration ought to be, but it isn't, is the issue of property tax. At the local level, we have about the lowest proportion of revenue from property tax in the nation's fisc across the world, just about actually. One would have thought that as property values rise, greater rural-urban migration, that's one positive impact on the fisc. But we don't have it because we don't collect it, particularly the local level finances. That's one issue I think that one could even have a special session on local level finances and the impact on growth, impact on urban infrastructure, etc. Those are somewhat unconnected points, but that's what occurred to me while listening to all of you. It just remains for me to thank all of you for participating, to all the listeners, to the viewers who are participating, and just keep watching your emails for future what we call flagship seminars from the Center for Social and Economic Policy. And of course, we'll be happy to give us suggestions on what subject should be tackled in these seminars. Thank you very much again.